When a multi-billion-dollar deal teeters on collapse because the CEO's translator bails at the last minute, an underestimated delivery girl named Maya Alvarez steps into a glass-tower boardroom and speaks 4 languages. What begins as a simple act to get paid becomes a collision of ambition and conscience. The CEO, Damien Klein, must confront his ruthless instincts. An investor, Anya Chen, pushes for profit at any cost. And Maya, whose multilingual fluency springs from survival, not diplomas, holds a mirror to the consequences of decisions made in rooms like this. In a cinematic swirl of tension, scent of coffee, and clipped corporate diplomacy, the negotiation morphs into an ethical crucible. Through translation, silence, and an uncanny ability to read what is left unsaid, Maya shifts the balance of power, forcing each player to choose between greed and redemption. The story is a tight, emotionally rich study of voice, value, and the invisible labor that holds worlds together. The conference room at Klein Dynamics sat on the 50th floor like a glass island above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows swallowed morning and spat it back in shards of light across a long oak table. At one end, Damien Klein rested his palms on the wood as if steadying a storm. The shape of the storm was a single leather folder, new and heavy with printed pages, a draft agreement that could bend markets and reconfigure neighborhoods. He had rehearsed this meeting in the mirror of glass and steel. He had rehearsed the precise lines he would need to smooth the pride of the delegation from Guangdong, the blunt pragmatism he'd use with Anya Chen, the investor who never smiled unless profit was in the margins. He had rehearsed how to look unmoved when confronted with nuance and culture he barely understood. What he had not rehearsed, because he had never needed to, was silence where his translator should have been. The translator had texted an hour before, "Emergency, cannot make it." Ibrahim, who had been with them for 3 ventures and who knew both the subtleties of Mandarin idiom and the worst of corporate euphemisms, had a fever or flight delay. No one knew. What Damien knew was the clock. The delegation would arrive in 10 minutes. The window of their patience for a delay measured less by minutes than by the degree of ego involved. Anya sat nearby already, compact, precise, perfectly made. She tapped the face of her tablet, the mechanical tick of someone who lived in inputs and outputs. Her voice, dry and efficient, had once slipped into something almost warm when she praised Damien's last quarter. Today she had the coldness of someone who believed that emergency was nothing more than another variable to be managed. "You could have postponed," she said, not looking up. A dozen voices in the room might have argued for delay. Anya argued for consequence. She was in Shanghai last week, in Lagos the week before, and everywhere she saw the same law. Time turned to money, turned to leverage. Damien shouldered the responsibility, made the rounding nod. "No," he said. "We close today." He kept the thin film of certainty in his voice. People believed certainty. People followed it. He had been following it all his life. From the hallway came the ordinary percussion of the city. Heels, the distant half-memory of traffic, a bicycle bell pain-stopping somewhere below. The door buzzed. 2 men in charcoal suits stepped in with practiced stoicism and the delegation's leader, a woman with a high bun and a face like a map of patient rivers. They moved with a careful economy of people who had charted their own fortunes. A translator trailed at their heels, but he was not Ibrahim. He was young and too literal, his English coming with a chirp that made the leaders tighten. The room shifted. Damien rose to greet them with the elasticity of someone built to perform politeness. He offered hands, brief smiles, the correct arrangement of light conversation. The young translator, Li Wei, stood behind the delegation, gloved hands folded, gaze flicking like a nervous bird. They took seats. Coffee was poured. The leather folder lay open like an invitation. Maya Alvarez arrived 20 minutes late and 3 hours early to everything else. Her backpack smelled faintly of tomato and basil because she had been up since dawn needing dough to fill orders for a small chain of night shift workers. She delivered boxes of sandwiches to buildings like the one that housed Klein Dynamics because she could read the map of the city with the certainty of a pulse. Delivering was straightforward. A path, a building, an elevator that smelled of lemon and cigarettes, a lobby with an attendant who always forgot to tilt his head up. There was industry in her shoulders and the music of other languages in her mouth. She had never imagined that those languages would get her past security into an executive suite. But here she was, pressed against a glass wall because of a mistake anyone else would have called petty. One of the delegation's lunch orders had been lost in the hallway. The receptionist had called down to security. Security had called up to the 50th floor because the delegation was important and because the sandwiches were, as Anya will later whisper with disgust, cheap theater. Damien, who kept a small roster of trivial kindnesses to perform in times of stress, a vase of peonies, a paperweight with a company logo, the occasional handwritten note, had waved the request through. The business of maintaining a global empire sometimes required tending to small human inconveniences. He had not imagined that the concession would bring Maya Alvarez. When the elevator opened and she stepped out, there was a moment of disbelief that tasted like lemon and ozone. The room's hum folded around her, the breath of men and women who had neither time nor use for delivery girls. She was 4 languages at least, Spanish and English, of course, the Portuguese she'd learned from a neighbor in the dorms, and Arabic, because of a scholarship program that had kept her afloat for 2 hard years. She had not intended to be a polyglot for money. She had been a child needing to make herself found in other tongues, to make herself less alone. She had translated for her neighbors, for battered wives, for strangers at clinics who needed someone to say take 2, or hold the baby, without the rattle of misunderstanding. A security man intercepted her in the doorway. She offered a box with the nervous smile of someone used to being invisible. He checked her credentials with a bureaucratic patience that meant he would rather have been anywhere else. Then he saw the name on the label, Klein Dynamics, Procurement. He let her through. Damien watched her from across the table, the same way a man who constructs deals watches a new variable. She wore a uniform that had seen many shifts, small stains of rosemary, an elastic band in her hair, sneakers marked with slashes of concrete dust. She moved like someone who had 100 maps in her head and kept them folded into routes. She carried the lunch tray like a diplomat with a crucial message. The delegates glanced up. The young translator smiled his nervous smile. Anya did not look at her at all. The rooms are altered, not hostile, not welcoming, curious in the mild way of good coffee cooling on a table. Delivery for Klein Dynamics, Maya said in English, then in Spanish as a reflex when one of the delegates' eyes flicked in recognition at the cadence of her accent. One of the delegates, a thin man, with a laugh that hid a sharper thought, brightened. Spanish, he asked. She nodded. Sigh. Small talk happened. Orders confirmed, a joke about the inaccuracy of elevators, a distracted apology for the mix-up. Then the thin man asked, casually as the city sleeps at night, do you speak Mandarin? Maya didn't expect the question. Her Mandarin was thin, the kind of pidgin that had been sorted together from phrasebooks and one intense summer at a community center when she'd worked as a volunteer. It would not have passed an entrance exam. But she had the truth to it, a willful intake of tone and phrase. She said, tentatively. A little. It was the wrong answer in the exact right moment. The lead delegate smiled the smile of someone who had a private calculus for surprises. We're starting a negotiation, he said. Our translator did not arrive. Do you understand enough? Or do you know someone? The young translator, Li Wei, flushed a shell of uselessness. The delegation's patience thinned. Damien could feel the moment like a crack. The document would require more than direct substitution of words. It required someone who could navigate meaning and the cultural freight that language carries. He could have refused. He could have insisted on protocol. Instead, in a voice that had been trained by risk and necessity, he asked, "Can you help us, Ms. Alvarez? For the translation of a lunch order, you'll be paid. For the translation of a business meeting, we can discuss compensation." Her hand tightened on a napkin. She was pinning her future to a table she had never imagined entering. Her stomach, which knew the hollow sound of rent due, said yes before her head did. She set the sandwich tray down and swallowed. She spoke Mandarin, like someone who'd learned the words in a locked train carriage and unrolled them with care. It surprised the room to hear everyday sounds turn into usable sentences, the warmth of the neutral canopy of I can help. Li Wei, whose training had been all the right syllables and none of the music beneath them, watched as a delivery girl took from him the only thing he knew how to offer, the role of conduit. The first exchange was careful, formal. The lead delegate outlined a clause in their draft, an exclusivity period, rigid timelines, a penalty structure that would make any community dependent on the contract feel the hiss of being sealed out. Damien's version, practiced and sleek, emphasized scalability and supply chain integration. Anya's pen hovered like a waiting missile. But the negotiation quickly became more than words. Small signals slipped, a delegate's fingers rubbing a small scar, the way he avoided eye contact when the profit projection was listed, the way Anya's eyes standardized the room into numbers and flickers. Maya translated words, and then the silence between them. She started to notice, in a way that literature names reading the room, the things people left unsaid. Your timeline, the lead delegate said in Mandarin, requires us to commit to a pipeline that will likely displace small producers. Can we ensure a community clause? Damien had the stock reply. We can offer relocation support, severance for smallholders who must be displaced, and training programs. Our capital will increase market access. He expected the delegates to nod and show gratitude at the invisible charm of money. He expected Anya to smile, because profit could always be spun into benevolence. But the lead delegate did something that unsettled the table. He asked about water tables, about the environmental impact study that the contract seemed to obviate, about the way a village of fishermen would be forced to change the times of their lives because a conveyor belt needed midnight deliveries. The words had weight. They landed like stones. Damien's throat made a motion, a tightening like a paywall. He had always believed you could buy time, and that time would let you smooth over consequences. He had not believed time could be asked to make moral choices in the middle of a contract negotiation. Maya translated and then, more daringly, added a punctuation that was only visible to those who listened for it. In Mandarin, she softened the corporate insistence. In Arabic, she hinted at the fishermen's dawn rituals. In Spanish, she let the memory of how entire blocks of the city had been reshaped by last year's development spill out like a warning. Her voice, which had carried other people's small tragedies across waiting room counters and clinic doors, began to bring the texture of life into the room. Anya watched her with a flat curiosity. She liked things that could be measured and then scaled. Maya offered something unmeasurable. The reality that people lived and breathed markets and moved their hands according to seasons, not spreadsheets. To Anya it sounded like inefficiency. To Damien it sounded like a crack in the plan he'd built to protect himself from guilt. Conversations frayed and rewove themselves. At one point Damien, unaccustomed to the warmth that language could reveal, tried a tactic he used in boardrooms when someone else's emotion threatened to inconvenience the agenda. He imposed a deadline. "We need a yes or no today," he said. "Our shareholders expect movement." Maya translated verbatim, but she added the shape of the noon sun to the words. In Mandarin she said not simply the deadline but the strain that it implied. The delegate's leader's hands folded. He spoke into the translation with a slow patience. "You ask us to choose between livelihood and liquidity. To say yes today is to say our people must find new ways to live tomorrow. To say no is to let the pipeline run through untouched. Is there no way to reconcile?" There was a silence, a small, dangerous thing. Anya's fingers tapped. Damien breathed. Then Li Wei, the young translator, leaned forward and said a sentence in halting English that the more established voices had missed while they were prepped for commerce. "We can restructure." He said it with the primitive hope of adolescence. "We can restructure with a clause for community shareholders. We can create a cooperative model." It was the kind of thing executives scribble on napkins and then forget. It was also the kind of thing that could make a boardroom collapse, or heal. Anya bristled. "That would limit returns," she said. "Profit margins would be shaved in the name of moral hygiene." She saw numbers falling and, beneath them, the board raising eyebrows. Damien surprised himself by resisting the reflex to say yes to the safe thing, the glide into legalese and their next appendices where inconvenient things go to die. He had, in his life, made deals that hurt people and then rationalized them with the calculus of growth. Today something in him had the face of a sleeping child. Maybe it was the leftover of a conversation he had had with his sister 2 nights before, about the way fortunes accumulate like sediment until someone else digs them up. Maybe it was the tiredness that comes from a life of constant ascendancy. Or maybe it was that on the 50th floor, looking over a city that had names for its own neighborhoods and grievances. He could feel the particular wrongness of a covenant that asked others to lose their place for profit. He found himself asking, not for the boardroom, but for the negotiation, what would a cooperative look like? What would the timeline be if we scaled it with safeguards? What would be the cost of ensuring community equity? Li Wei translated structurally. Maya translated with color. She described, in Mandarin, a model where a portion of production would remain in local hands, with distributed ownership and a phased pipeline that allowed time for environmental remediation. She shifted the vocabulary from cost to investment in continuity. Her Spanish made the idea tighter. Her Arabic gave it the rhythm of a thing that had been considered with the patience of elders. The delegates discussed in low tones. Anya had a look of someone fighting for oxygen. You would sacrifice speed, she said, not even trying to hide how she equated speed with triumph. You would lose first-mover advantage. Damien felt something inside him negotiating with itself. There was the scarred, older part that knew the price of forbearance. There was the younger part that wanted to believe he could build something that lasted without bulldozing what it stood on. He caught himself thinking of the delivery girl's hands, calloused, steady, capable of handling bread and truth. He found, with the faint startled pleasure of someone seeing a new color, that he wanted her to be part of the conversation. She had become the heart of the room by translating not only words but the reverberations they would have. Draft a clause, he said, and his voice was thinner than he intended. Draft a clause for community equity and environmental oversight. Put milestones, remediation schedules, and a cooperative share. We will adjust our projections. The room's temperature changed. Anya's jaw set. The delegate's leader allowed himself a small smile, the smile of someone who had entered the room fearing a bulldozer and found instead a table. But the resolution was not a single note. There are always people who will try to bend kindness into leverage. As the legal teams began to sketch the committee that would manage the clause, Anya leaned toward Damien with a small, sharp face. You know this will hurt our Q4 forecasts, she said. You know shareholders will not be pleased. Damien, who had once thought he owed nothing and now found himself owing more than he had imagined, answered with a truth that surprised both of them. We will be honest. We will explain the choice. We will accept the consequences. It was a sentence that wanted to be both atonement and strategy. It would not profit the way the old clause would have, but it might give the company something more durable than temporarily swollen margins. The heavy file closed and reopened into a dozen new pages. The delegate's leader asked for an additional guarantee, an independent environmental audit to be done by a consortium acceptable to both parties. Damien agreed, after a pause that tasted of iron. He wished to be the sort of man who could sign a paper and mean it, not as a PR fig leaf but as an axis around which better things could pivot. When the principal points were agreed, there was a moment of quiet relief. The boardroom offered itself up like a theater for cheap applause. People shook hands. The delegation thanked Damien with a formal warmth. The young translator smiled as if he'd discovered a planet under his shoes. Anya's expression did not soften, but she did not leave the table. She folded, like steel, into the plan. It was only then, as coffee cups were being cleared, that the head delegate turned to Maya and said something in Mandarin that everyone in the room understood, not because they all spoke the language, but because they had been moved by what had transpired. You did more than translate. You made us understand what we mean to each other. Maya's breath hitched because the sentence contained a scale of acknowledgement she rarely received. She had been invisible all her life, until that morning when an elevator could have kept her from entering a room where the physics of power played with people's futures. She had the image of her mother in a kitchen with onion-stained hands and a voice that always said, "Say what you mean, Mija." She thought, in Spanish, of a tight family kitchen where language was survival. She responded in a halting Mandarin, and then in Spanish, "I only said what you left unsaid." Damien watched her more closely than he'd ever watched anyone who didn't wear a suit. He saw the way her shoulders held a map of things he had never navigated: modesty, pride, the economy of a life spent translating for others to be heard. He felt, sharply and humbly, the old armor of him cracking. The notion that the top had to be carved from the bottom by force felt suddenly less like victory and more like theft. When the meeting broke, Damien walked Maya out to the elevator. The city below was a forest of roofs, and the river wound like a dark vein. He cleared his throat, a small human gesture he had never practiced with those who did not carry titles. "You spoke 4 languages," he said. The sentence felt ridiculous and necessary. "You spoke like you knew the people behind the words." Maya looked at him with a plainness that made him see the length and the cost of her days. "I grew up hearing them," she said. "I know how people say help when they don't want to be a burden." He felt a new kind of hunger, like the rawness of an unexamined conscience. "Would you consider working with us as a consultant, not as a delivery girl? We need people who understand the neighborhoods affected." She laughed, a short, tired sound, "and trade my shift for a desk." He offered her a business card with a slightly clumsy hand. "A desk would be optional. A fair wage and a seat at the table are promises." "I can't." He stopped, aware that promises are often small things sold to patch larger sins. "I can only offer you what I know how to give." Maya looked at the card. She looked at him. She thought of rent and of the tiny scholarship that had kept her afloat in college, of the old woman in her building who crocheted overnight scarves to make a few extra dollars, of the clients she had translated for without charge, because language is sometimes charity. What would they think? She asked, not unkindly. She was thinking of the people who counted on her sandwiches. She was thinking of pride. She was thinking of a life where to accept is to betray some small truth. "Let them think what they want," Damien said. He had not meant to be blunt, but bluntness cut. "If you come, you will have authority. You will be heard. If you decline, I will at least know that I made the offer." She considered. The elevator hummed. Outside the glass, a crane took down a block of old brick, replacing it with the fantastical promises of progress. "I will think," she said finally. And it wasn't a refusal. It wasn't a yes, either. It was the honest geography of a woman who knew she had to measure consequences before she surrendered her hours. When she left, Damien stood alone at the window for a long time. The city breathed beneath him, its small tragedies and small triumphs stitched together by people delivering sandwiches and people building pipelines. He had been desperate for a translator this morning. He had been desperate, he realized belatedly, for someone to tell him what his words really meant. The deal, when it became public months later, was hailed as a hybrid model, a corporate pivot with a human bent. The headlines told the story in headlines and percentages. They did not tell the story of a delivery girl who kept her envelope thin and her options open. They did not tell the story of a young translator who learned that his voice could steer a room. They did not tell the story of a CEO who stayed awake one night worrying not about stock, but about the fishing nets downstream. But sometimes, late in the afternoon, the building's procurement desk would ring for lunch and the receptionist would say, "Delivery from Alvarez," and Damien would find his pulse lighten at the name. He had placed another call. He had not wanted a trophy employee. He wanted a conscience that could steer the compass when the storms came. He wanted to know the names of the people who did not fit on a spreadsheet. Maya eventually accepted the consulting offer, not because he had dazzled her with titles or promises, but because the first meeting had shown her a man who could be different, if only because he'd had the courage to choose it. She kept delivering on weekends. She taught community workshops about language and negotiation and rights, because the work of translation stretches beyond words into empowerment. Months later, at a small community center where sunlight dived through a row of cracked windows, a group of fishermen came forward with a small carved boat model they had made in gratitude, a tiny thing of wood and love. Maya stood in the doorway with Damien, who had come because the photo of a child holding a fish had reached him, and he felt that he must see what had been saved. "You did the right thing," one of them said, in halting English. He pressed the model into Damien's hand. It was rough and lopsided and perfect. Damien looked at the boat. He thought of contracts and clauses and the way a single line in a document can redirect a river. "We had help," he said, and his voice was small with gratitude. Maya smiled. She had been the interpreter of more than language. She had translated consequence into a form that corporate ears could understand. She had, in a room of polished wood and fluorescent courage, put the human back into the arithmetic. That night, at his high-rise window, Damien looked out at the city and imagined the lines of connection that made it function. Delivery routes, food carts, market stalls, cranes, the impossible tangle of small livelihoods. He understood that power is not only an accumulation of capital, but a responsibility to the net it had been cast over. He had been desperate that morning without a translator. He had been even more desperate without an honest mirror. Maya had given him both. The city moved on. Buildings rose. Deals were signed and criticized, celebrated and revised. But a small clause lingered in the new contract like an extra line in a song: community equity, environmental oversight, and a commitment to keep some part of production in local hands. It was not perfect. It was, in the terms of the world, a start. Maya kept translating. She taught others how to say the things that mattered, and how to hear what mattered back. Damien kept learning to listen. Anya adjusted strategies and watched her forecast settle into a new pattern, sometimes narrower, sometimes steadier. Li Wei moved into a job in corporate communications, his voice less nervous now that he'd seen how translation could not only carry words but change lives. In the end, the delivery girl who spoke 4 languages did what translators do best. She connected islands. She moved between rooms and made the world just a little more comprehensible. And the CEO, desperate for a translator at the start of the day, found that translation can sometimes save more than a deal. It can save a conscience, a river, a village, a boat.